Gallery at OCAD University. I'm Linda Columbus, and I'm the programs coordinator here at the gallery. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we stand and create. So Onsite Gallery is the flagship professional gallery of OCAD U and an experimental curatorial platform for art, design, and new media. So currently on view until December 10th are our two inaugural exhibitions in our new expanded space. So we have Raise a Flag, works from the Indigenous Art Collection, 2000-2015, curated by Ryan Rice, Delaney Chair in Indigenous Visual Culture at OCAD U. And For This Land, Inside Elemental, presented with community partner Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, and featuring new work by Two Row Media, Jackson Two Bears, and Janet Rogers. So at the front desk, you're welcome to take some of our printed materials. We have two exhibition brochures, which I'll show you here. So there's one for each show, Raise a Flag, which folds out to a beautiful map designed by Jordan Bennett. And For This Land, Inside Elemental, which looks like this. And then we also have a brochure here, which has a little bit more info on Onsite Gallery and our upcoming exhibitions. So thank you so much for joining us today for this talk with Lindsay Nixon and Ryan Rice. So Lindsay is a Cree Métis Saulteaux curator, editor, award-nominated writer, and self-loathing art history grad student. They currently hold the position of Indigenous Editor at Large for Canadian art. And Ryan Rice is Kanekahaba, is an independent curator and the Delaney Chair in Indigenous Visual Culture at OCAD University, and of course, curator of Raise a Flag. So I'm happy to pass the conversation over to you both.
Well, thank you. I don't know if we need mics, but I guess for recording we need mics. So thank you for coming out this afternoon and welcome. This is the last program that we've done for this exhibition. And one of the things that I was thinking about when we were developing programs with artists, symposium, workshops, we just had a really good workshop yesterday on pennant making and renaming or re-implementing traditional names to place. We also had Susan Blight here, who is part of the Onoma Mikwa collective, who have been doing the place naming in Toronto as well as in North Bay. So she gave some information on that project and where it's going in the future. We've had a symposium with former directors, curators, and administrators from the Indigenous Art Collection, which is part of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. So this exhibition is pulled from the National Heritage Collection, which is just over 50 years in its existence. And the impetus for me bringing this exhibition together was to bring attention to this National Heritage Collection, which many people still aren't aware exists, but also to provide a counter-narrative to the Canada 150 period that we're in, as well as address issues of reconciliation that can be teased out of almost all the works in this exhibition. I like to tell people when I do tours that this exhibition contains the truths. And I give a tour and we talk about some of the works and how Indigenous artists have been raising these issues for the last 50 years. Issues aren't new to Indigenous communities or Indigenous folk, but because they are becoming more public, more people are becoming aware of them. So it's since the opening of the exhibition, I would have done, as of yesterday, 37 tours, and I have 3 more left this week. So the exhibition closes on next Sunday, so if you know anybody, send them down. The gallery is open Wednesday through Sunday, and it's open in the evenings as well. So it's the last chance before these works go back into the vault, pretty much. Who knows what is next for these works. I know 2 of them are actually going to the Art Gallery of Mississauga. But as part of the programming, I wanted to also have a time to reflect upon the year that we just ended. And I thought Lindsay Nixon would be a great person to invite. and have a conversation between different generations and different perspectives on where we are today within the Indigenous art field. And I want to congratulate her on this amazing, the summer edition of Canadian Art, and bringing that together, and how proud we are of this. To see this on a newsstand is, you know, is sort of a game changer, because it inserts and occupies a national position. And you know, I mean, just unfortunately, Canadian art isn't everywhere anymore. You can't even get it at the airport. But when you walk into one of the bookstores and see it, you know, it really stands out, and I think it is exceptional in the way that it has occupied space. So I want to welcome Lindsay, and if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and let us know what you're up to, and we have a lot of questions that we pose to each other, and we'll just try to have an organic conversation.
Thanks for having me here today. I feel so honored that you invited me, and you're such a personal mentor and hero of mine, and I look at your career being like, that's where I want to be, and that's how I want to do things. And your kind words about my issue, I feel like this issue was such a labor of love, and I really drew from my relationships and the people that I saw doing work from their relationships. And also this issue and its prominence doesn't exist without this image that Dana Danger created for the cover. I think that was so, I really view this as being like a really pivotal moment in the discourse for me, and I think Dana and I contributed to that equally, so I feel like it's not just something that I own.
So what was the public reaction to this, not only public but institutional, or how did you gain the support of Canadian art to actually just flip the switch on them, like just translate it with increased syllabics, not recognizable to their branding? How did you go about that, and what was the reaction from them as well as the public?
Well, I mean, I benefited so much from my mentors who went into that institute before I even was there. People like Heather Abel-Liorte and you. Who else was on that advisory committee? Candace Hopkins and Richard Hill. And you all gave very concrete advice to the editors about what should happen when I came in. And because of that foundation that you guys set up, as soon as I came in, they just gave me carte blanche to do whatever I wanted with the magazine and this issue. So I feel like you guys really paved that way for me, honestly.
Yeah, it was exciting. I mean, to David Balzer to contact me and pull together a committee to look at identifying an Indigenous editor at large. There was a little slight hiccup within that, because they didn't want to name it an Indigenous editor. And I said, I will only participate if it's the Indigenous editor.
What did they want to name it?
Just editor at large, Indigenous issues.
Indigenous issues, okay.
Yeah, or Indigenous art.
Right.
So we said that, you know, we really need to position ourselves within these institutions, or within this framework, and people need to take that position, I think. And I think you're comfortable in taking that position.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about putting intention to action and how that's really important to my practice, and how I started in from a place that started with a very community-based practice. So I want to continue that and not get too wrapped up in the industry, and I want to continue those practices within my work. I will say that some of the public reaction, I think, from settlers was honestly mostly positive. When I went to a material cultures conference in Tulsa a couple months ago, and there were a few of the older generation who were just like, what is this? Like, the white anthropological curators who were like, I do not understand this. Like, why is this on the cover of Canadian art? So maybe that's not the audience that we're speaking to so much anymore. We're moving away from that a bit. But honestly, some of the most intense reactions were within the Indigenous art community, and it kind of shows me that it was time. It was time for a shift, and around the issues we were talking about and the artists that we were presenting, and the fact that it created such a sensation shows me that it was needed. Yeah.
And what was that shift that you felt?
I mean, I kind of called out toxic bro culture in Indigenous art, and I presented a very feminist-minded issue that was completely comprised of queer, two-spirit, non-binary women, folks who were doing community-based work. And I think there's this idea, because the way that there's this thing happening within Canadian art institutions with Indigenous peoples, where Indigenous peoples are breaking through for the first time and taking up space in a new way. And there's sort of this Indigenous elite kind of forming that we're not really talking about in terms of class. And what is our responsibility as administrators to emerging artists, or artists who aren't getting the same kind of airtime because their work isn't readily read as being part of this canon that we've imagined being Indigenous art being.
And this canon has really shifted, not significantly, I would say, but it has shifted a little bit, and there has been momentum. I remember in at the Y2K, at the New Millennium, Canada Council invited me to write an article on the future of Indigenous art. And I also wrote an article for Spirit magazine, which used to publish a lot about Indigenous art. And if I go back to that article from 2000, I could reprint it with just a few different names. So the shifts haven't been that. There's change and there's transition and there's momentum, but it's at a different pace, I would say. And I'm wondering if you think the pace is based on the TRC, the residential school systems, issues related to political systems like the UNDRIP. How does that affect the way we navigate this field?
Well, for the TRC, I feel the outcome of that really being reliant on identity politics a bit, so bringing in Indigenous representation to galleries or in art history departments or within exhibitions, but there hasn't been a lot of conversation about ethical responsibility around that and like what that should look like and what good Indigenous curatorial practice would be if it was reciprocal to community. And I think that the UNDRIP was really important too. I think you're right, because it created this space where art was just, Indigenous art was becoming, well, it was always like that. I guess there was the AIM era movement too, but this rapid spread of community-based imagery that was also defining Indigenous art, but was totally outside of the institution. So I think there was like a fracturing there, and it kind of created like a precedent of, there are folks who are working more on a community-based level, but still creating important work, and who aren't appealing to these institutions in the same way.
And then that question is still something heavily on my mind, is the idea of community. Because community has shifted significantly to mean other things. And I think you raise a lot of, you identify different communities that we are used to recognizing in the past. But is there an Indigenous art community, or is there Indigenous art communities?
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the silencing logics of creating a singular Indigenous art community, because I think Richard Hill really hit it on the head when he wrote that column earlier this year, that we're kind of wrapped up in this moment. And it's funny that you say to me that it hasn't even shifted so much since you started working, that we're in a moment of halt and critique where we're not, we're afraid, like there was a certain time where Indigenous artists and Indigenous curators had to be in such close solidarity with each other in the face of really racist institutions. But in the process of that, I think we really lost sight of our ethical responsibility to our own community. So I think that there is communities, yes, and there's different branches of Indigenous thought and art that are emerging, but also that they are becoming and are still increasingly marginalized within this field of community of Indigenous art, which tends to be monopolized by a historically masculinist perspective.
And that's something that's been carried over almost consistently over the years. And what about those masculine voices who talk about stepping aside or elevating women artists or two-spirited artists? There's a lot of that conversation, but is that actually happening, do you think?
I mean, it's so funny to see, even to be at this conference that I was at this weekend around Indigenous Futures in Winnipeg, and to see the way that the discourse has shifted so quickly, just within a year, and folks are starting to try to integrate critical discourse around love and care and two-spirit kin, relationality, kinship. And I do see this issue as participating and creating that discourse within this community, because I didn't see those logics there so much before. What was the question? I totally lost it.
Has people have the masculine presence made room for others?
No. I feel like there's this thing that happened. I feel like it's women and Two-Spirit who are making space for each other and just working really hard. And I don't think it's untrue to say that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far as these guys sometimes. And then we're also paying it forward in ways where we're creating so much more space for our women and Two-Spirit relations in ways that these dudes were well situated and could bring us into these spaces and could do good work for us, just refuse to do. And I see that field of thought, that masculine field of thought, really being wrapped up in institutional critique versus community action and working on the day-to-day to change structures. It's more about having their voices heard and being the Indigenous celebrity du jour versus being conscious of the relationship they're creating in this community.
And I think that's important, is the relationships created within a national arts discourse, because it's the institutions that are elevating certain people, right? Which is something that I've always been interested in, is elevating a community, or probably all my shows include 30 artists, which is crazy, especially in small places like this. But I always thought it would be important to have a collective voice. And I've always had not so much joy in doing singular exhibitions, even though we talk about the need for solo exhibitions. I think that's more of an art world kind of target, because I think there's still a lot of power in the collectivity in terms of bringing voices forward, especially when we're all distinct and nation to nation. We have different relationships to where we are, so we're not all representative of a certain idea. Looking back at the last year, are there exhibitions or works that sort of stick in your mind?
Yeah. First I just want to respond to saying that in our generation, I think that you were such a hero, because you were never afraid to curate emerging artists. You weren't just working with folks who were well situated or Indigenous famous. You always were bringing in new voices and making sure that those people were heard. So that's something that I really respect about your curatorial practice. And this last year, there's been a lot of really amazing exhibitions. I don't even know where to start. Lisa's exhibition at is it Mississauga? Kitchener, Carry Forward. I think that's one of the first time in 10 years that I've had such a profound emotional relationship to an exhibition. It was just beautiful. I would just return from Insurgents Resurgence, and just the sheer amount of space that they took up in the gallery, it was just so amazing. You walk up to the front of the gallery and you see these huge Jordan Bennett prints, and then you walk into the gallery and there's Hannah Klaus just taking up the sky world, and there's a huge painting from Pat Monkman. And my friend Brandy's little brother, he's graduating high school right now, and he's kind of going through this experience where he's doing that native growth thing. He's turning 18, he's getting into hood stuff, and he doesn't see his future so much. And so when he first came into the gallery, he saw that, and I just saw him looking at Kent's picture. It was the one that he painted referencing the Winnipeg neighborhoods where Indigenous peoples lived. And I could see that he was having this moment with this image, and it just made me realize that we're talking about this so much, but there's still so many people in our community that still haven't seen these works and still haven't had these profound experiences with them, and still haven't seen themselves represented in these ways. And this is still such important work, even if it feels it's just important work.
One exhibition that I've seen this year that I don't think got any recognition was Vanessa Dion Fletcher's exhibition at Tangled Gallery. I thought that was an incredible, the installation that she created in there should have been more recognized, I would say.
Is that Vanessa's mad repping.
So I just joined the Ontario Art Galleries, OAG, Ontario Art Association of Art Galleries board officially last Monday, and first task was to attend the award ceremony, and it made me wonder because while I was watching, it was clear that we weren't represented within the structure of the public institutions. We don't work in these spaces. We don't have jobs in these spaces. There were many exhibitions that included Indigenous art. So do you think we need to mimic something like that where we elevate our practice and have awards?
Awards? I mean, I have such a mixed feelings about awards. I would love if we had our own self-determined awards, but I would also like to see that be ethical. I would want us to be giving out awards to across community and not just to like singular figures who are increasingly famous within arts institutions. But I think about this a lot, like how do we do self-determination within the arts, and specifically around publishing, and some of the experiences I've gained in the last year honestly makes me wonder if we do need our own publication, if we do need these own structures, because can we ever trust these people to deal with our truths and our histories and the ways that we would deal with them?
Yeah, I think that representation of telling our own story is still something critical, especially it plays differently for artists because artists work with institutions and curators who are not specifically focused on Indigenous work. But as a historian, a curator, an educator, our focus is sort of like from that lens. And I think we still need the journal, we still need publications, we still need access to articles written about us, on us instead of about us. I think there's still that sort of like discrepancy in there because you're reading it about the other still. So I think there is still a need for this to happen, and I really don't think it's about, like, I know some people say it's ghettoization, it's marginalization. I look at it as putting us at the center rather than at the margin. I know that you participated in a residency about the possibility of creating a journal. Has anything come about with that?
No. So that residency was 10 people, and of course, when you get 10 people in a room, there's going to be a lot of different desires, and I feel like I knew when we were there that like capacity would wane the second that we left that room, basically. There's also, like, there was institutional stuff happening too that like I was on the periphery of, so I don't see that journal coming to like fruition. But that said, I have been in conversation with a lot of different people in the community who are like, well, yes, let's do this, like let's build capacity, we could do this together. And I have gained a lot of knowledge on this past year that I do want to take and pay forward to my community, because I just see there's such a dire need for Indigenous art critics. The Indigenous art critics that we do have burn out so quickly because of the demand on their emotional labor. And then the criticism that we do have tends to be a little bit stifled, so it never reaches that editorial point. So I feel like we're there, but we're still not breaking in the same ways. Not that we need to like situate ourselves or fit within this framework, but I would really like to see it, like us as a community, amp it up and start engaging with each other's work in critical ways, because what's happened is we're seeing this shift from anthropological, but it's moving more into descriptive or like pop coverage, and so it feels like an awkward fit for community and art right now. It's something that I'm trying to figure out. Tell me.
And the headlines are headlines that are still carried from the 70s. Challenging tradition, new and innovative, breaking stereotypes. So if you go back and look at articles that you wanted to read in the Globe and Mail 30 years ago, those are the same headlines that people are using today. So everyone thinks they're coming at it from a new perspective, where it's really regurgitated information.
I think that's a huge issue for our generation, is that we remain so disconnected from the histories before us, and I've made a conscious effort to connect intergenerationally with my peers, because there's so much history and knowledge that you need to learn or responsible to learn before you walk into this community.
Is there anybody actively writing a blog or using social, like open access opportunities in Canada? I haven't come across anybody.
Like specifically arts writers? No, I mean, I used to have, I started like a arts Tumblr, and I think that's kind of where that kind of went viral, and that was my segue into publishing, but I've since shut that down, and I can't think of anyone else. There's more, this generation I see doing, there's a lot of stuff happening on Instagram, actually. Like, there's entire Instagram accounts for like Indigenous art history moments or Indigenous art happening. So it could just be that I'm shifting away from what the new technology is, and I can't like see it, but.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder why we don't utilize this tool. And I don't even do Twitter because I know it's so much work, right? No one's paying you to tweet, and it's like, I have Instagram, I have 2 followers, my niece and my... I follow 2 people, I don't follow anybody else, but people follow, because it is labor, right?
Yeah.
But why do you think people aren't using those tools? And one example I've seen recently, and I can't remember the artist's name, she's an OCAD graduate, she won an RBC Painting Award probably 10 years ago, a Black Canadian artist. She said she got rid of her website because it was a lot of maintenance and just uses Instagram and tags the shit out of everybody. And I was like, what's your relationship to these people? And she's like, you just tag them and they might see it. And I was like, that's an aggressive way to market your work. And I don't see anybody else doing it. Now that I became familiar with what she was doing, I was like, that's kind of brilliant. It's probably a pain in the ass for these institutions to get these emails or tags, but it's a strategy, right? Is anybody, do you know anybody who's doing that?
Yeah, I think you're right. There has been like a definite shift to Instagram. I'm seeing artists and art critics like just curating profiles more and more. But in terms of personal blogs, I can't think, like there's Cheyenne Turian, who does a lot of cultural criticism on her blog. I have a website that I'll throw up some cultural criticism sometimes, but I think it really is an issue of capacity. Like, it might feel like there's a lot of us coming to this institution right now, but my experience trying to commission writing or just trying to get a handle on what's happening right now in Indigenous arts writing is that it's kind of like a waste time. There's not a lot happening, and folks are just so burnt out that they can't, like. And another issue is there's something really specific about Indigenous art where our critics tend to come up as artists first, and so they're very multidisciplinary. So they have their arts projects to think about, they're probably curating another thing on the side, and then the writing practice comes last, usually.
And where would you position yourself within scholarship and practice? Because I come to this, and I come to OCAD as a curator, as a practicing curator, and never had to go through peer review that you have to go through in academia. You write your catalog, you write your brochure, you have your 500-word limit text, you work within these parameters because that's all you're allowed, that's the only space you're allowed to give unless you get a catalog. Coming into this field, I shift to become a scholar, and then now I'm supposed to be going after peer-reviewed articles, which is a pain in the ass. And it's like, who's reviewing this? Who are my peers? Yeah. The peers aren't curators or artists or community members. So how do you, like, you're entering this and you're in it. Where do you see yourself situated? Because this isn't peer reviewed, right?
Yeah, it's so funny that you talk about peer review because I'm literally in conversation with Clayton at the ACC right now because I was talking with him about how the ACC might support Indigenous art magazine sometime in the future. And he was like, well, there was a push from some board members to do an academic journal that's peer reviewed. And I was kind of like, I don't know if you guys know what that actually entails or like if that's what you even want, because we don't have enough Indigenous art researchers right now to be having an only Indigenous editorial board. Like, you would be having your writing edited by white people, and from personal experience, having your work peer edited by white people is terrible. Like, the comments that you get back are so, they vary from just total ignorance to just mean-spirited sometimes. Like, I don't know if we need that. Like, do we need outside people coming in and legitimating our art? And we've already been doing that for so long. Like, why does that feel important?
Because that speaks to the decolonial apparatus, right? But we get co-opted by it. Like, I know there's a project and it's all talking about decolonial, and it shifts right back to this peer review practice. And I have an article in the recent Ricard Journal that is a rewrite of an article that I wrote in 2004, I think, or 2002. And the reviews I got were like, ouch. You know, it was like, the person, I was like, did this person even read my article? And then the Indigenous review was so like, this is ready to print, this is information, this is scholarship that we need out there.
Yeah.
So when you put the two of them side by side, it's like, why would I want to participate in this practice and not share with ourselves?
Yeah, and I think someone who comes from a background where I had a creative practice. I started as a creative writer, and I came to arts writing because of artists like Delaney Chair who were creating work, but then it wasn't being covered extensively, and it wasn't being covered right. And like, I just saw that no one was doing the freaks right. So to come to a space now where I have to think about giving up autonomy that I've built with artists to support them in defining their work and like what it means to them, it feels so like the reverse of that than to pass it on to like a white editor who would take that sovereignty away from both of us.
What city do you think is doing it right?
What city?
What city across this country, in terms of, like, I posted on Facebook the other day and I said, roll call, what are the curatorial projects that happened this year? I knew most of them, but I wanted to see if people were going to contribute and participate. And when you look at it, and Tanya Linklater was in here the other day, and she's like, there was a lot. And I'm like, not really, that it was like sort of normal. But there was a lot of exhibitions that included Indigenous artists, but not a lot that were curated by Indigenous curators, right? So Toronto, which is interesting, always has some kind of presence, probably because of, I would say because of Imaginative. Imaginative always programs exhibitions as part of their festival, so there's always that moment in Toronto when that's happening. Ottawa has been I think a pretty consistent player because of the community there and how people have activated those artist-run centers and commitment from not the National Gallery, but all the other galleries that over the years. And then I recently, from Ganawage, which is just outside of Montreal, and participating in that space, I can't believe what's going on there anymore. Like, I can't, the stuff that's happening now was something that we couldn't even get into the door of any of these galleries or institutions so that's why I'm saying, like, who do you think is doing it well? Which cities, has some consistency?
Well, I could be biased because I'm from the prairies, but I just got back from Winnipeg and I loved everything that was going on there. And it's really exciting to see two badass Indigenous women in prominent positions in a gallery. Like, I don't see that happening in any other institutions across Canada. That's definitely something. And I think Vancouver has always been a fixture for the Indigenous art community, and particularly around Brunt Gallery, just all the archives they hold and all the work that they supported that would not be canonized, it would not exist if they hadn't supported it. So there's a huge infrastructure there. I'm excited just knowing and living in Montreal what's going to happen there over the next year. I'm pretty excited to see how the Indigenous art community is going to shift there, because there's something happening there too with French artists where they experience kind of a double marginalization within the larger Anglo community and then as Indigenous artists. So to see the curatorial delegations that will be coming through and the Jogi project, I feel like that's really going to build an infrastructure there.
So there has been consistent especially artist-run centers who have been quite supportive for quite some time, like Grunt Gallery has had a huge focus. Where does some spaces like Urban Shaman and Tribe exist today? Because before they were like this new, fresh outlook on curatorial practice, on platform for artists, but they sort of become institutionalized like every other artist. Like, we're not hearing much about them anymore. There's the Edmonton Collective.
Oh, CC1, yes, I cannot
They're
believe
doing
that.
a lot of good
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, that's a city that's like, it's so funny because I lived in Edmonton for 5 years before moving to Montreal, and I left because there was nothing happening there for Indigenous art or Indigenous community in the same ways. And then to leave and then see these amazing Esqueoac create this, it's just like a femme posse of like curators and artists in Edmonton. It's very cool.
Can you tell everybody a little bit about them?
Yeah, so Tsitsiwan is, it fluctuates, but right now I think the core collective is Jessie Short, Jade Carpenter, Becca Taylor, and Aaron Sutherland. And so they do community-engaged art curations in and around Edmonton. They're being conscious not to just do them in galleries. So for instance, they curated a Dana at Latitude 54 last year, and I think it was the best, like, that's the time that I've seen her work curated in a way that was the most respectful. Like, that's the standard that people should be living up to when they're curating this kind of work.
And because you're now in this position, do you get fed a lot of information of stuff coming up?
Oh yeah, like I feel like my inbox is just like full constantly, but it's that thing of picking through what's legit and what's not. And I feel like I'm always surprised about how it's really easy for me to see, but there's still a lack of knowledge from Canadian editors or white editors about what defines a voyeuristic versus a self-empowered representation or a curation. So that's still something I feel like settlers need to step up and build capacity around.
It's, do you think we're at the moment where this is understood as Canadian art? Indigenous art practices is understood as Canadian art within that canon?
I mean, I don't think we want to be, you know? I think we're pretty much like, we don't want to be Canadian, we're something else, and I think that's what this was about too. I didn't want to put Dana's image on the cover and then be like, Canadian art, because that's not who Dana is, so, right? So I just felt like this was a really important intervention to make, and David Balter was so supportive, even though there was like I feel like maybe a little grumble amongst our board, but David was very supportive of that.
I guess that's where I get a little skeptical in many ways, is that do we become mainstream? And in the article that I revisited, I said, where do we fit? Maybe we don't. Like, you know, maybe we choose not to fit in. But it feels like maybe we are choosing to fit in many ways.
And I also recognize that that's really easy for us to say too as administrators and curators, but that artists have a whole different industry that they have to push up against and work within just to put food on their table with their craft. So I understand when they have to step into these institutions and kind of play the Canadian art game or the international art game, and I don't judge that either.
Yeah, and with this exhibition, one of the things that I do in the tour is to center it that it's part of everyone's history. All the students who come here, I say this is not only Indigenous art history, but it's Canadian art history. And I think that makes them look at it in a different way. When we walk through each piece and talk about the works, and talk about sort of like the accolades that people have been granted in here, 2 Sobey Award winners, long listers, artists from who had national retrospectives. So I said there's this huge sort of like recognition within this body of this collection right here. And I said that this has to be understood also from a Canadian perspective, a Canadian lens as part of that story. Because if it's marginalized, it can remain marginalized, right? So when we're rewriting histories or we're rewriting curriculum, the idea of decolonizing curriculum or education is about embedding these, but I think they need to stand still within like a sovereign representation of being different. So this exhibition, I talk about, or I think about occupying the space, because I'm the guest here. I had to propose an exhibition. It came through various means, and I went to a talk with Eve Tuck and Robert Diaz here at OCAD in the spring, and it was what is your disruption? And that really clicked for me, because I think we're in this year, it is about those disruptions. So my question to you is, what is your disruption?
Yeah, I think you're so right. There's something happening this year, and maybe it was Canada Council when they sort of kickstarted it by saying that they were going to put more funding into Indigenous art, and so the capacity grew in cities across Canada to hold space for Indigenous curations and Indigenous art. And I think my disruption is, I just want to keep us accountable, and I want to make sure that we're being accountable to future generations. I don't like going to conferences and seeing it being this sort of like elite group of artists who already have a lot of airplay and a lot of power, and then looking back in the audience and seeing the entire future of Indigenous art. These are the people that we need to be really stepping up and offering opportunities to, and I think we need to like be critical of the limits of kinship and recognize sort of veering into cliquishness. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Or
yeah, I mean, I had a few for you.
Like here, I see some of them.
Do you want me to look? I mean, you're not obligated to answer any of these. I know I'm going to put you on the hot spot. Yeah, I guess we've talked a little bit personally about how different Indigenous art was for your generation when you guys started out as comparison to now for us. And I was wondering, how was Indigenous art used to create community when you started out, and especially when you didn't have, I guess, online communities in the same way? How did you guys come together, and how did you guys build community-based curation at that time?
Well, I think my participation comes from through a community lens, where mainly through artists who were working in Montreal at the time, but it also comes on the heels of these anniversaries that get elevated and funds get attached to. So in 1992 was the quincentennial, and there was a lot of recognition. Indigenous art was sort of like the trend that was going to get elevated that year within the framework of discovery. Montreal was also going through another celebration. I think it was the 350th celebration that year. So there were 2 Indigenous art exhibitions, but it was all people brought in rather than recognition of the local. So pretty much almost Quebec artists were not involved in that exhibition. And it seemed like it was the moment where Indigenous art was recognized, but 1993 happened, and it was like the hangover. It was like the party was over, your opportunities are sort of like been washed over, and SCANA, the Society of Canadian Artists of Native Ancestry, that was sort of the pinnacle for them to get their work recognized through their lobbying efforts to get an exhibition at the National Gallery at the same time as the Museum of Civilization with Indigena. So I think people became complacent or thought there was momentum in careers, practice, publishing, and it sort of like crashed very quickly. And I was participating with Scawanati and Eric Robertson, Arthur Renwick. We were all participating sort of like as the next generation of SCANA. And we seen that we were treated differently. Recognized like as students or a different, within a different capacity. And we said that if we don't do something, we're not going to be able to build on the momentum that just took place. So that's where we started Nation to Nation, and it was a labor of love. It was all about community engagement within our practices and how do, as artists, how do we get our own communities to recognize the work that we're doing? Because our communities weren't going to the museums, and still today, it's hard to get people within these institutions. So that was sort of like the big impetus of like what we started, and it happened, and it was a trajectory for us to move projects forward and sort of think big. So we went from the local to the national quite quickly, and that was through Native Love and Cyber Powwow. I was just in Montreal 2 weeks ago talking about 20 years of Cyber Powwow, and we talked about creating in the virtual space when none of us knew what that was, and we all had to make the analog version of the virtual to exist and imagined as, cyberspace. And, it was sort of like that shifted all the work that we were doing. And, positioned me, shifted my career to become a curator, because I seen the need for that role to move the field forward. And it's interesting, today it's still, there's so many people who don't understand what a curator is, even within the mainstream art world. People don't understand the role, the reasoning, the action. It's still comes with this privileged perspective that this person is up here. So that's why I said the momentum hasn't really been high, because we're still not getting communities into these spaces to see the work that we do. And these spaces still aren't ours, right? So it's how do we move that forward? How do we make this accessible? How do we make information discourse accessible? Because not everyone's buying a catalog. Not everyone. I'm just in a new catalog that came out 2 weeks ago. It's $75 US. So no one, not many people are going to be buying that catalog. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. And I think you really pointed when we talk about Indigenous art histories, we talk about SCANA as being a really pivotal turning point. And your generation really wanted to resist the institutionalized structures that they had put into place. But do you think that technology had anything to do with the shift of who kind of moved forward with Indigenous art and then who remained kind of in that space, the SCANA space?
I think technology just made things easier and opened up the country. It made it more accessible, so we reached more people that way. However, we always relied on the networking of everybody that we knew, right? So it was like, you interviewed us this summer, and we pulled out our archives, and it's like typed letters. The technology that we used was copy art in Montreal, where they did postcards, and that was, photocopy art was like one of the big things that was going on in the 90s, and we relied on that means. That was our technology. We didn't pick up the phone because we couldn't afford a phone plan, so it was letters, or if we were somewhere and we was just sharing information. So it went that way, and then Cyber Powwow came out of the AOL era because of those chat rooms, and then what that was creating. And I think that was what made us all get email addresses. And then that started. And then that shifted quite significantly in terms of curatorial practice. I remember there was a conference where a curator talked about how easy it was going to be to curate because you just now look at images on a computer, and people were critical of that idea, but that's how we do it today. I mean, not everyone has the means to be traveling to do studio visits, across the country. It's like, send me some images. I see some images you post on Facebook. I see your Instagram. I mean, this is why, for a curator, it's important for me to see what people are putting out there. And I don't know why people don't promote their work with the tools that are available the same way.
Yeah, I feel like that's a funny tension that's always kind of been within the Indigenous community, and I don't know where that comes from, but the older generations will, or maybe this will be the generation that disrupts that, but I keep hearing these stories about older generations being like, oh, that's not traditional. I'm fearful of that, and kind of trying to express that.
Yeah, I think people assume it's a form of showing off. But I'm like, if you're a maker, you want people to see the visual work.
Yeah, why do you create like beautiful bling if you're not going to show it up? Oh, and I think a really interesting thing about your generation is also that this idea of curatorship didn't really exist until recently. And when you guys were organizing, you weren't talking about curating in the same way. So you kind of came into curating as it evolved in Canada. How do you think that shaped Indigenous art?
I think both Scalinati and myself came to curating as a collective, so members of a collective organizing within the collective. So not removing ourselves as artists from the organizational role, and then starting to understand, oh, maybe we are curators. Like, not recognizing that as being something that we can be, but then understanding that this is something we're doing that other people get paid for, or have jobs, or have positions, or write from. So that really shifted the way we were looking at that. And I participated in the sort of national dialogue with the Canada Council on implementing the curatorial practice residencies. So I think that's where the shift comes from, is when the Canada Council is now acknowledging sort of 1 or 2 year grants for people to move into curatorial roles. And it was mainly artists taking on those positions. Unfortunately, they always really only supported projects. The idea around it was to have somebody in place, and then they would be kept on by the institution. The only one was announced. Adrian Stimson was supposed to stay on with the Mendo, and that never happened. And Jamie Isaac recently was just hired at the Winnipeg Art Gallery through that residency.
Becca Taylor also was one of those residencies, and Becca Taylor, and then she went on to create OTC1 and now is doing BACA.
Yeah, so I mean, so those residencies were opportunities, but they were the project funding that we are so used to within our own communities anyway. Whether it's social services, mental health illness, PrEP is a new one that's just come out. So they're always only in place to get you started, and they never have a long-term effect. Because I worked at the Native Friendship Center, I think, have you worked, Dana? Friendship Center? You work at Native Living Shelter, right?
Native Shelter, yeah.
So through these organizations, there's always funding, but it's always like the illness of the day, or the issue of the day. So it's like, when I was there was funding for AIDS prevention, glue sniffing, and another one, and they all last maybe 4 months. So you start a project, and then you have to shift your thinking to the next issue. And you never build the momentum to get things going. So it was sort of the same thing within the curatorial practice, I would say, where people were getting in, but had to maintain independent projects. So it was always from project to project to project. And when we started the curatorial collective, we counted 5 Indigenous curators within institutions, and today you could put, it's almost the same, right? Almost the same, 5 different people, but pretty much 5 are within these roles in institutions.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing your knowledge too, because it makes me realize how much of Indigenous art has been determined by funding bodies, and that's kind of interesting to think about, and a bit of a troublesome, I guess. I was wondering what you think about the current state of arts admin and how that's going to shift, and now that there's longer funding and organizational funding, specifically for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, I haven't paid attention to Canada Council funding because as working within this institution, I don't have access to it because we're educational, so I would have to do independent projects. Yeah, I don't want to mix my practice with my work practice, so I haven't really paid attention to those new funding models. I did pay attention to the traditional one that was created, and it was enormously hard to understand, to maneuver, because my niece, who has relearned basket making, wanted to access the funds, and I said, I'll help you. I'll help you with the grant. And I went in and I was like, I don't know what they're asking. Like, I don't know what you could say. I could write it within a contemporary perspective or curatorial, but as a basket maker, I couldn't help her navigate that application. So I don't know what has changed within that structure. But there is more opportunities that we need to go after. And for Nation to Nation, one of the first things is that it was DIY. We're going to do it ourselves. We couldn't. If we would have waited on funding structures, we would have fell apart within the first year, because none of our projects would have gotten funded if we didn't do it on our own.
Yeah.
And we created that sort of like. We created our own way of self-funding. So I guess like a sovereign means of like maneuvering ourselves within the art fields.
Yeah, your archive is so interesting because you have like all these handwritten letters that you wrote to each other, and then a letter of Canada Council denying you funding. So then you guys were just like, we're going to do it anyways, and you pay each other like $35 for an artist fee. Like that was like, you guys just did it. Like you went in there. And you tell this funny story about how you go into the loft and there's no walls, it's like all open windows. So then you guys went out and got bookshelves and lamps, and you like created this whole setup. Like you guys were so DIY. And I wonder how much of you guys not being able to identify as curators was you being told that you don't belong in those spaces. Scabanati told me a really interesting story about when she was traveling for Native Love, and she came into the gallery, and the galleryist was like, "Are you a curator?" That was the first time that she ever thought that she could be a curator when someone said that to her.
Yeah, one of my first, when I realized that I was in this role and I was pursuing it, was what made me decide to go back to get a master's degree was I was being consulted on so many projects and no one was paying. And when I suggested twice, why don't I be the co-curator of this exhibition? And they said, you're not a curator. So that's when I said, okay, if I'm going to be in this position, I need to do something. And that's when I said, okay, I'm going to pursue a curatorial degree.
It kind of makes me mad, though, that someone who has given so much to this community had to prove yourself with that degree.
Because it's based on those structures, right? We talked about the colonial structures that are within institutions. It's interesting that we're in the time to decolonize, and we're in the midst of a cluster hire. If you've heard, we have a cluster hire of 5 Indigenous profs that are going to come in. So it'll be interesting because we're not the same as other universities where you need a PhD. Because we're practice universities, people will come in with different experiences, and we have to look at how those experiences fit in here. So we have the opportunity to shift that, rather than where someone, a comprehensive university, you can't get in without the PhD. I seen McGill's call for Indigenous media, and it's like, who has a PhD in Indigenous media? Nobody. So it's a fail right away, right? It's like, failed search, like, let's just put it out there.
That's so funny. I think you're so right. Like, these institutions are like, let's bring in people, we need better representation, but they're not thinking about how they need to restructure themselves and their expectations of, I see these applications that are like, you need an Inuit curator, but they have to have an advanced degree and speak 2 languages, and it's like, these people live so isolated up north, like they have such trouble with access, and think that and to leave to come south even to access those things, like it's just a total ignorance of the realities of our lives.
So I think we'll open it up to questions. If there's any questions from the audience, we can entertain ideas and conversation.
So I wonder about that access to education and knowledge, because you hear about those positions, but then it's like there's other positions that are hiring for of Indigenous people to help integrate others, and it almost feels very strange, because it's I think I've been thinking a lot about value systems and who's placing value on what, and who are we playing into, and why is not certain levels of education good enough, and things like that. And I know that there maybe needs to be a standard, obviously, and or maybe there's a critique against that as well. Like, what is the standard? What is value? What are all those things? And it seems so short-sighted. Like, you're asking folks to have this knowledge, but then you don't even see that you're actively also hiring folks to like usher in those people, and like kind of missing what the actual structural systems are, like preventing folks from even getting into those doors. Like, where's the help in that? Because if you're just going out headhunting for like whatever, you may not find. And then who gets those positions? Like, they're like, oh, there's no Indigenous people to fill it, so And then maybe that's an open thing. I've been thinking about that a lot, because
It goes back to access to education as well, right? I mean, you're still going through those systemic barriers to get into a program in many institutions. We're sort of like, we're either rushing or we've been doing this for a long time, right? So some days it feels really rushed, and some days it's frustrating because we've been doing this for 30 years, right? Trying to get our place foot in the door, more or less.
Sometimes these Indigenous artists aren't even making it through the programs because the barriers are just so great to them completing, around mental health and poverty, moving to a new city from the north, having no support. Like, these are not small issues for Indigenous artists and curators who are coming up. And it makes me think about Raven Davis's article that they wrote this year for Canadian Art, titled "My Mom Gave Me My MFA," and it makes me think about the ways that when we talk to each other or speak to each other about who we are and our experience, I feel like we always talk about people we work with, or the people that will vouch for us, or the different projects we've worked on, collaboratively with people who are known within this community. So I feel like they'll never judge us by the same standard by which we judge ourselves. And it makes me think about Billy Ray Balcourt's continued pressure on institutions to have a specifically Indigenous-run arts and writing program somewhere, that all the staff that administer it, the professors and everyone involved would be Indigenous. That exists in Santa Fe, but we don't have that same sort of capacity here, it seems.
Yeah, we still have a long ways to occupy that space, and playing that double-edged sword is where you'll also have people within our community say that's ghettoization, that's marginalization. We don't want to be part of that. So I mean, it goes back and forth in many conversations. But the systems are all similar to each other that we work under or work through, as a student, as a professor, as a curator, as a writer. We still have a lot of maneuvering to do within these spaces. Any other questions?
It's also concerning to this decolonial approach to curriculum and institutions. So I was wondering, where do you see a more prolific or optimistic future for Indigenous art and art writing? Is it still within the institution and this taking the space, or is there a need to actually create a counter space, another space then? Since we still have to decolonize to match, would it be better to create a counter space? How does it work with alliances too?
I know a lot of people will say, have asked me about this collection and why isn't there a museum for this 50-year-old 4,500 piece collection. The federal government doesn't want to do it, but who's going to step up and who has the money to start an institution? There was an article in the Globe and Mail last week about cultural centers and how little funding they receive to keep the doors open. Those are community-based initiatives that they rely on bake sales to run language programs. So a lot of people say, well, why don't you guys just do it, or why don't you open your own systems? You know, we fall under the same colonial structures because we have to meet those standards. So I know firsthand in my community, we started a high school called the Ganawagi Survival School because of a bill that was identifying who gets to be taught in English, because it's in Quebec. So the parents said, no one's going to decide what language our children get taught in. We make the decision, not the government. So the next day a high school was created. But over those years, for our students to be accepted into post-secondary institutions and colleges, they need to meet all these standards to get in. So language equivalency, math. So they all fall under those colonial structures in many ways, and people start adapting them because that's what's in place to move it forward. So systems like tribe or urban shaman are within that artist-run structure. They're still within sort of like a framework of what has been created in Canada for those systems to exist. So what is the model? I said, I don't think the model exists yet. I don't think there's independent spaces that are actively successful beyond like a pop-up. Like Nation to Nation didn't exist because it became so much work. So it was project-based, and then we start getting into that understanding that there was grant money, timing, people wanted to get paid. We became responsible to artists wanted Carfax fees. So the structure of DIY started getting to be institutionalized, and people weren't as participatory as we expected them to be.
I think about it in terms of publishing, and I know that we don't want to ghettoize ourselves, and I know that artists do need certain types of recognition when they're breaking into the industry. That said, I feel like there's always going to be a barrier in Canadian publishing if we're not publishing for ourselves, like by ourselves, and we don't need, I don't think it needs to be specifically an Indigenous-only publication necessarily, but it'd be cool to see a collective-run publication like Mice Magazine, for instance, get as big as Canadian Art because they're so responsible to the communities that they organize from, and I just don't see that happening in publications right now.
I don't know if we answered your question, but...
Very insightful, so yes.
Any other questions?
The idea that I keep hearing from the conversation is the word capacity. You know, like I think you're both speaking about it in so many different ways, and obviously there's so much work that needs to be done that it's almost like a 3D puzzle. So obviously there's a lot to be done. I was just at a talk yesterday at the public library, and it was really interesting. It was 5 different people from different, in quote, like artist-run centers, but like not like kind of council funded, kind of more pop-up, self-initiated kind of DIY things. And it was really interesting because so many of the people, I think 4 of them were like white speakers, and there were. I hear a lot of parallels between what they were saying, so it's in what you guys were saying. So you know, kind of like they became curators by default. It was more like, well, no one's doing this, so I'll just do it, and then they become seen as curators. So it's like, well, now I have to figure out what that means. Also working with resources, etc. But the one speaker who was talking from Black Artists Network in Dialogue, it was. I felt like she was speaking from such a different place because they decided to. They had a really strategic way of building capacity that I was kind of like, oh, I love that. She said, we're coming at it from as corporate people. They're all like people who occupy like a middle class in their community, and they decided to like run this out of necessity. But it also meant that they didn't have the kind of suspicions about just raising money, institutionalizing, etc. They were like, this is what you have to do. And they managed to buy a house, they're the only artist from center in Toronto that owns their own building, and I'm just so in awe of them. I don't think that necessarily has to apply with it to everybody else. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I guess I'm thinking about how to build capacity, right? Like, I don't know, just to frame it as a question, like, given that there's so much work that needs to be done, like, what would you identify as kind of like a key priority that would have a lot of impact in terms of capacity building?
Intergenerational membership. I feel like there's, if we're not focusing on who's getting opportunities, then we're privileging burnout, because we're creating this situation where we only have a limited pool of artists and curators to draw from, and so it really creates a lot of burnout in the community. And I think that this amazing thing happened. I was at the ABTEC conference this weekend, and Heather Iglo-Liorte announced that the WAG will be opening an Inuit Art Center next year, in 2020 rather, and she was invited to curate the inaugural exhibition, and she for sure could have accepted that on her own, but instead she decided to do it with 3 emerging curators who are little known within Canada. And I literally teared up when that happened, because that's a huge shift for Indigenous art, and I think it really sets a precedent where we need to be in terms of the Indigenous future mentorship.
Yeah, there's 2 things that I would answer within capacity. Is one is presence. People need to be present and not just hit the interest button. Right? That interest button is a pain in the ass for someone who organizes consistently, because you think 50 people are coming and 4 show up, right? So capacity, I would love to see more Indigenous people in these seats. I would love to see artists in these seats. I would love to see colleagues that I work with at OCAD in these seats. So if we're talking about change, decolonization, shifting the ways, we're providing access, right? We're providing information for people to do this. The other thing is, because I worked in the States and had gone back and forth and also did schooling in the States, their system is quite different from ours because they don't have the capacity of federal funding or provincial funding. So artists have to work like crazy to get recognized. And I feel there's no cultural economy within Canada in the same way that there is in the States. Even though art is commodified, we don't have the same relationship to it. So my question that I pose to my peers, my colleagues, other artists, other curators is, we're professionalized, so we need to support and we need to start collecting. So who are we buying? How are we buying? How are we supporting? Are we buying memberships? Are we giving, like, we write about this, we teach about this, we talk about this, we breathe it, you know, so how are we going to elevate that economy? Because I don't think, I mean, there's a difference between how artists function here than in the US or within a global market. But I think that we need to look at this as a critical point in how to, especially in our own communities, is how are we collecting? How are we collecting the cultural currency that's coming from our communities rather than having the ROM do it for us? And then in 100 years, we're like, we don't have access to our culture. So I think we need to really think about that in terms of capacity building, cultural capacity building within our own communities. Is how are we going to take that over? So I think that's a different way than building buildings or building institutions. I think that's a way to start. And like someone like Barry Yates has an amazing collection. Like, you know, he's been doing it for years and years and years. And it's like, we all should be doing that. You know, I probably buy one piece a year, and it's growing, but yeah, and now I'm like, I actually have a job. I can probably afford it more now. So like, these are things that I think we need to make part of our what we do as well, and support. Thanks. Any other questions?
I mean, it was really interesting, like the women at, I think her name is Karen, at BAND, Black Artists
Oh yeah, Karen.
Network and Dialogue, because they're doing that very purposefully. They're like, for every show, they ask the artist if it's available for sale. And if it is, they encourage the artist to be like, yeah, have like, you know, your $10,000 pieces, but have a couple like whatever, $1,000, $500, $200 pieces. And so to kind of think about how your economy works as an artist, but also they said that they're very purposefully invite middle class Black people, like supporters of the gallery, and explicitly say like, hey, this costs like $500, like don't you want it? And to create like a pattern of collecting within the community, which is a way of supporting the resources of that community, right? I find it so interesting that they're like just so clearly, explicitly thinking about how you build that, and just integrate it as like a regular thing of every show has that as an element, like you would do talks or whatever. That kind of, I don't know, it's very interesting. I love thinking about capacity. For me, like I'm just hearing a lot of like thinking and experience and labor that I see you both bringing. So I think it's fantastic.
And the value of artwork consistently goes up. It's going up, right? It's not
early.
It's not affordable. Like when I worked with this collection, the prices for acquisitions were not the same prices of acquisitions today. So people understand that their works go for a lot more. And it's like, I should have bought that. You know, it's like, I should have got that. But yeah, you see when there's an open call for the acquisitions through this program, one work could blow the budget. So do you collect one work, or do you collect works that represent that time period, that year, and then you have to disregard that artist? You know, it comes with a lot of, like, you have to strategize, and that's accountability as well, because your name's attached to these acquisitions as well, right?
Take note, get a Dana Danger and that Alien Q2 if you still can.
Still, get well, it's cheap. It's a very good song.
Yeah. A woman who was in here today, she's like, can I buy any of this work? And I said, if I sold work, I would sell a lot of work, but that's not my job. I leave it up to the artist. I think you Google them, write them. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
I guess we'll wrap it up then.
Yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up, and thank you everybody for coming up today.